Ambassador Jim Jeffries is the chair since December of 2020 of the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson Center across town. In the closing stages of his distinguished diplomatic career, he served as the Secretary's Special Representative for Syria Engagement and as the Special Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS, which he did until November of 2020. A senior American diplomat with experience in the Middle East, Turkey, Germany, and the Balkans. He has held senior assignments in Washington and abroad, including being Deputy National Security Advisor for the last year or so of the George W. Bush administration, as well as Ambassador to Iraq, Ambassador to Turkey, and earlier, Ambassador to Albania. And actually in the job he had in Syria, he was really called back to service for that role, but not exactly being the bilateral ambassador, I understand. He became, in 2010, a career ambassador, the highest rank, of course, in our foreign service. And earlier in his life, he was, from 69 to 76, an Army infantry officer serving in Germany and Vietnam. A service, the Army, that he has in common with Ambassador Chorba, our president. So with that, I give you Ambassador Jeffrey.
Okay. It'll rest out. Ambassador Hughes, thanks for the introduction and thanks for inviting me. Look, I have a problem, folks, because I made the mistake of coming early to hear what the others were saying, and I said, geez, they're saying the same things that I wanted to say, and they're saying them better, so what am I going to do? So I think I'm going to focus mainly on questions and answers to put you to work, but I do want to say a few things generally on, mainly at the not 50, but 500,000 foot level on Iran, what the nature of the threat is, why it has been successful, because I'm a believer that it has been successful, both the tactics it's used, although those were pretty well discussed earlier, and why we didn't do more against it, which I may be able to contribute to, and then where we should go from here, because right in the middle of this thing. Okay. Henry Kissinger, and this may have come up, has a famous quote about Iran. Does anybody know what it is? It didn't come up today, good. It is, Iran has to decide whether it is a cause or a country. Notice the alliteration, Kissinger did this, country, cause, anyway. But he actually knew the answer. His real question was, we have to decide whether Iran is a cause or a country, because Iran has already decided it's a cause. Now, Kissinger, in his thinking about Iran, and frankly, everything else, and this comes from having spent some time with him on not his last book, but the one before on Global Order, and then for 4 years on the Defense Policy Board, his thinking was, while brilliant, very, I won't say predictable, but based upon first principles. And he developed them all in writing his thesis at Harvard, which became a book put out in the 50s called, say again? A World Restored, right. And everything you need to know about foreign policy, I'm biased, is in the first 3 pages of the introduction, where he says, hey folks, I mean, he doesn't say it like this, it's actually very dryly written. Hey folks, you got 2 kind of international situations, revolutionary and non-revolutionary. In non-revolutionary situations, everybody more or less accepts the global order, albeit with changes over time. Think of 1815, the Vienna Convention, to 1914. And there, diplomacy reigned supreme. Then you have revolutionary situations, and he wasn't referring to ideological revolution, although remember he was talking about the French Revolution and the French Empire under Napoleon, which was ideological, and he, of course, he was writing it at the height of the highly ideological Cold War. But when he said revolution, he meant not willing to accept the international order and trying to change it dramatically. There, and his words were blunt, diplomacy has no role. Now you stop and say, wait a second, the first third of the book is all about the diplomatic actions in the coalition against Napoleon and between the coalition and Napoleon. He isn't saying that you don't do diplomatic stuff, you don't do démarches. What he was saying was you use them as a tool, but that's not the strategy. The strategy is confrontation. Now, confrontation can be offensive, rollback, or regime change, or it can be defensive, as we did in the Cold War, which is containment, deterrence, but it's confrontation. In the non-revolutionary world, diplomacy reigns supreme, but by that, what he means by diplomacy is accommodation. Everybody has to accommodate each other as countries go down, as the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary did in the 19th century, and other countries rise, such as America and Germany. But they were all accommodated under the system until crash, 1914. And Iran is a revolutionary power. And therefore, the main problem we have in the region, not the only one, because there are other people who are revolutionary powers, mainly Sunni Islamic militant groups who share much of the same philosophy of Iran, only they don't have a state, other than briefly the Islamic State had a state and we smashed it. But Iran does. And that's the genesis of the problem we have. Now, Iran, and the analogy I use, and I'll come back to this, was Communist China, initially tried, and we heard a lot about this earlier, to directly advance its agenda. Most importantly was the 6 years it fought in Iraq to conquer southern Iraq, its oil fields, and its Shia population, and it failed. It then took us on in the Gulf, in the Tanker War, and it failed again. Lesson learned, don't confront the West and its Arab friends directly. You'll lose. China learned that lesson in Korea, and then in Quemoy and Matsu in 1958, where Eisenhower threatened nuclear weapons. Don't confront the West and its friends directly. Find ways to do this indirectly. Communist China did this. I was talking with the ambassador who spent his whole lifetime in East Asia, and he's seen elements of that through indirection, asymmetrical warfare, terrorism, and proxies. Whatever we call them. I heard my friend Ryan Crockett didn't want to call them proxies. Well, call them whatever, Jabberwockies, I don't care. But what they have in common is they share the same overarching goals. They coordinate together, and Iran provides a significant degree of economic, military, and diplomatic support to them. They don't take orders necessarily from Iran, or they will refuse orders at times, and they do things differently. They surprise Iran. I think they were surprised by the 7th of October. I think the Houthis probably surprised them as well. I know Iran's friend Assad surprised them with his North Korean nuclear site to some degree. But at the end of the day, it is a revolutionary thrust into the region. It has been tremendously successful. Again, you heard about this today, in 5 countries or quasi-countries in the region: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza. At the cost of, by my count, 1 million people, not by my count, by UN and US official figures, 1 million people killed in those conflicts, many of which I was involved in, and 15 million people displaced. That's a huge, huge cost. And look at those states. Which of them do you want to live in now? The only one partially livable at this point is Iraq, and it's hitting down, I think, buoyed only by its enormous energy exports. So how did this all come about? First and foremost, we didn't accept that it was a revolutionary state. It was a problem among others, and the problem defaulted to, and you heard a lot about this also this morning, for good reason, the nuclear file, because it was immediate, it was present, and it was concrete. It was like, counting the centrifuges. I was involved in this at various times. Some of you probably also were, and it became like a sorcerer's apprentice kind of expertise, how many centrifuges they have and what percent do they enrich to this week and such. And it was important. And I think for reasons you heard that the JCPOA, while it did change the whole dynamic of our strategy, allowing enrichment under different conditions, I think under certain circumstances it was a good agreement. And my main complaint against the late Trump administration dealing with Iran was pulling out of it because it put the Biden administration probably where it wanted to be anyway, but in a very difficult position in terms of doing anything against Iran in the region. But the other thing about the region is if you don't accept that what Iran is doing is a revolutionary challenge at the core of regional security, but one of many problems, you focus on other problems. Sunni Islamic jihadists, Al-Qaeda, later the Islamic State, Saddam Hussein until we got rid of him, the huge mess of 20 years of Afghanistan, the efforts by Bush and later in the Arab Spring, Obama, to democratize and turn the Middle East into, this is a cynic criticizing them, into Denmark. And also, how can we forget, pivoting the hell out of the region, okay? Despite all of the strategic, economic, and other things that you all know, we're never gonna pivot out of the region. But anyway, so we didn't act effectively to stop it. In fact, we, the Israelis, the Saudis in Yemen, Israelis in southern Lebanon, and then in Gaza, we taking down Saddam Hussein and a dozen other things, actually helped the Iranians in various ways because we were focused on other things and we didn't see the threat. I'm not even sure today that we do see the threat. However, we're faced with, again, a dramatic escalation because with the attack of October 7th, an Iranian proxy, an important one, returned to direct warfare with a direct threat to the existence of a very important state, important in the region, important for us, Israel. And in the escalation since then, which I think has been mainly kept under control admirably by the United States with assistance from the countries in the region and Israel, but still, Iran has had to engage more directly militarily, as we saw in the strike in Israel, because the thing has entered a different phase. We can win this phase, but it means changing our attitude towards Iran. The one point in the last 20 years where I thought we got it half right, coincidentally, when I was in government, but I'm not going to claim credit for it, I'll give the credit to Mike Pompeo with the support of Donald Trump. Because it reflected Trump's views and everything was clear with Trump. We were pretty effective in Syria. In fact, I'd say the ceasefire that we put in place, we've frozen that conflict. Now, that's not a great solution. It isn't something I'll put on my resume, but frozen conflicts are better than losing conflicts. And in Iraq, for a short period of time, Pompeo, taking a very tough position, was able to push back. How did he do it? By making every decision related to the Middle East primarily in response to the question, what does Iran want us to do or not do? And then we do the opposite. That sounds simple. It worked. It's not easy. And at times we said, we can't do that. That's always, there's humanitarian issues, there's our allies and such. But it was a conscious decision to deviate from our policy of whatever they want, we stop. Whatever they don't want, we do. And over time, because this is all attrition, this isn't a knockout blow. It's just like what we did against the Soviet Union. It was pretty much, that was our policy towards the Soviet Union, folks. Whatever they want, we're not going to give them unless you do a deal where we get something we want in return. That you can still do with the Iranians. I'm in favor of, I would be talking to the Iranians every day. But I would be talking with them like Nixon talked to our enemies, from a position of strength. I'll never forget, because I was in Vietnam. Wave after wave of B-52s, 18 shot down, and they kept coming. And North Vietnam said, we've had a change of heart. Let's sit down and negotiate. Anyway, that's my idea of the way forward with Iran, so I'll open up for questions.
Thank you. I'll take this a little bit off of Iran and bring it back to a revolutionary state. So where does China fit into that analysis?
Ambassador, do you want to answer that question?
No, please do.
We've got an actual China expert here. We may have more. I would say, I don't know. It has manifestations of both because it has a huge stake in the existing system. And that stake can be placed at risk. And unlike Iran, I don't think China has made a final decision, but China experts would perhaps contest that. What I'm sure is that we, the United States, and I think we, the West, have not made a final decision whether this is a competitor or a relationship of competition or contesting or cooperation. There are elements of all three, and the administration's position is clear in that regard. Now, Russia, that is a revolutionary change to the system. It's not that Putin wants to, that he dreams every night of recreating the Soviet Empire to and beyond Berlin. It's that he is tearing up all of the limits, understandings, treaties, and behaviors that would restrain him or his successor from going in that direction. And the Germans have a saying, and they certainly lived up to it or down to it in the 1930s, Das Appetit kommt mit dem Essen. Your appetite comes the more you eat. And so that's the problem with Putin. So I would put him in the revolutionary category. I would put Iran in the revolutionary. I wouldn't put North Korea. They're the rare example of a country that is doing crazy things out of insecurity. Sure.
Do you believe that if we go back to a maximum pressure campaign that, as you say, seems to be working to some degree under President Trump, that actually could put Iran back in a box?
If done correctly, and I'll come back to that, if done correctly, it raises the stakes for Iran, increases the risks and the costs by pushing back, not so much against Iran, although you have to do something with the nuclear program, but with Iran surrogates, and indirectly thus getting to Iran. So there are things we could do in Iraq, the things we have done in Syria. Ambassador Gabriel is the expert on Lebanon. He would know what we could do there, but it would be very difficult at this point because they have such a control over the society and it is in such dire straits that anything we do could damage the people. But that's another problem. Almost anything you do to the Iranians or their proxies will run into problems. First of all, some of it might not be consistent with international law. Secondly, what I would do to the Houthis would lead to a lot of civilian casualties. And this administration, for good reason, particularly as it's lecturing Israel, doesn't want to, take out all of the Houthis' high-value assets, which they have, the port, their governing facilities, and say, hey, this week we're going to take out half of them. If you don't stop what you're doing in the Red Sea, the other half are going next week. Maybe the Houthis wouldn't stop and they keep doing it, but then they would be paying a price that down the road could be fatal to them. And they would have to make that decision. I don't know which way they would go, but either way we win. They stop doing it in the Red Sea or you have a much weaker Houthi problem. But that kind of thing is very hard to do. The other thing is, I keep coming back to our successful containment of China's proxy-oriented policy over 20 years, but that also produced Vietnam. The other side will pick really weak places with really bad allies and will come up with really dyed-in-the-wool believers fighting for the Iranian side, and it's going to be very, very tough, and you can make mistakes, as I said we did in Vietnam. So, yeah, I think it can, but you got to say, is it worth it? What I would say is, I was arguing this concept before the 6th of October. I think what's happened on the 7th and since makes it more clear, yeah, it is worth it, because what we were doing before clearly didn't deter this from happening. Ambassador.
Yes. This alliance of Iran, China, and Russia, which was happening before, but really now it's a formalized pact. How does that change the security situation globally?
It is a commonality of interests. First of all, they all have, in the case of two of the three, Iran and Russia, at least in their regions, they're revolutionary states in the Kissingerian definition. In the case of China, the jury, as we just discussed, is out, but certainly many of their behaviors point in that direction. They have a common interest in weakening the United States and weakening the US-backed global order, be it the collective security component of it or the various values and other things, with the exception that China actually benefits from some of them, so China is an asterisk. But they do have different interests. An obvious one is China does not want Russia to use nuclear weapons or even threaten nuclear weapons in the Ukraine war because of the potential impact on those countries around China that could develop a nuclear weapon in weeks if they felt we were in a different world. The Russians are unhappy, this is from talking with the Russians recently, unhappy with Iranian influence in Syria. They feel it's coming at their expense. Syria is their crown jewel. It's a pretty, it's not a very shiny crown jewel, but it's all they have. If all you have is Assad, Syria, man, that's your crown jewel, whatever it looks like. And it's all they got, and they fought for it. So they don't want the Iranians to take over, and they worry. And the Chinese, I also met with a group of Chinese experts a few weeks ago, and they're very worried about China screwing up the Middle East, which is, of course, a investment and energy. Yeah. Because, in fact, one Chinese, not official expert, I guess we call him, said, we like the Gulf states, but the Levant, we're not interested. And my rejoinder was, yeah, well, the Levant, that's your friend Iran that's dominant there, that screwed the place up. Gulf states, those are our pals. We're there. And so I would say that it's less than meets the eye, but watch that space. Ambassador.
We're taking as writ Henry Kissinger's observation of almost 70 years ago, or about 70 years ago, that there are, revolutionary conditions or status quo or non-revolutionary conditions. Just listening to you now, and especially your observation about the jury still being out on China, made me wonder if perhaps Kissinger wasn't entirely right, if maybe the Chinese might be clever enough to pioneer a new category of their own that's neither exactly revolutionary or exactly status quo, as a great way to keep your adversary guessing and not knowing either whether to pursue non-revolutionary diplomacy or the measures of confrontation you'd take in a revolutionary situation.
That's really a good point, particularly as I think many of you know, Kissinger was very reluctant to brand right up to the end China as a revolutionary power, and actually urged most of the time, I won't say appeasement, I would say to listen to the Chinese. Yeah, there is a problem, and there was a problem when I read those 3 pages, much as I loved them, with any effort to create a grand theory. You need grand theories, and I would point to how successful the application of the grand theory, including by Kissinger, was to the Cold War, and how flaky our foreign policy has looked against everybody over the last 30 years, regardless of administration, because we haven't had a grand strategy and a grand idea. But grand ideas and grand strategies are black whites. We heard earlier, you turn the switch on or you turn the switch off. You're either in one category or the other, and life isn't that simple. But you got to start from some basis. I would start with the fact that, and so I'm dodging the question, Iran and Russia meet Kissinger's definition of revolutionary states. Iran, we're not sure because it manifests both an accommodationist power, Bismarck's Germany, and a revolutionary power, the Germany of Bismarck's successors. I'll leave it at that. The Germans are great for all kinds of expressions and examples. They've had a very tumultuous history. Ambassador Gabriel, then we'll get back to the folks at the first table.
So, Ambassador, paint a picture for us. You're now advising the president. Picture this for a second. You're now advising the president. What is the mix of diplomacy, deterrence, military? What are the tools and what does the policy look like to Iran? What would you tell him to do?
Yeah. Okay. First, and this is my private bitch. I can't blame this on Kissinger. I have a problem with diplomacy as a strategy. I see it as a tool. I wince every time somebody cites my friend Jim Mattis saying, give State Department more money and me more bullets. Now, I would say, give me some State Department people who are really smart, or give me more bullets. It isn't the money, and it isn't even diplomacy per se. Diplomacy is a means to carry out policy, and it's a means to carry out coercion, deterrence. There are military aspects to it and such. If you try to do the military stuff without watching the diplomatic side, well, I frankly think we have a great example with Bibi Netanyahu in the last 6 months, who has managed to turn an absolutely justified war of existence into international condemnation because of things they could have done differently without interfering in their military campaign, but they didn't do. And that's because they didn't pay attention to political, diplomatic, and other aspects. But that wasn't an absence of diplomacy, it was an absence of clear thinking. But to get to your question, I would say, okay. First of all, put somebody in charge of the entire Iran portfolio. Actually, we have somebody. He hasn't been at his job for a year now, Rob Malley, but he was the wrong guy to carry out my policy anyway. So get rid of Malley. And yeah, we had Brian Hook in the last administration. And then at the very end, Elliot Abrams. And then coordinate everything. The guys doing Syria, the guys doing Yemen, the guys doing Lebanon, the guys doing Gaza's a little complicated. The guy's doing Iraq. Meet with the Iran guy. And every single thing we do in Iraq, I mean, I'll give you a foolish example of how screwed up I think it is. Iraq is the big prize. Third largest oil and possibly the second largest gas reserves in the Middle East. Its geographic location, how important it is. Our Central Command's biggest mission in Iraq currently is to get the two separate Peshmerga forces to merge. Now, I was trying to do that in 2004. I didn't succeed. Then as ambassador in 2011, I didn't succeed. It's not very important. But we scurry off and put important institutions like CENTCOM or our embassy or the Near East Bureau or the entire Department of State doing these secondary things because we don't have a grand scheme of things. So the fact that we might lose Iraq, I mean, they checked look, I've heard, one of the guys I respect most, Jake Sullivan, just before October 7th saying, Iraq's one of our successes. It's still a democratic state and we still have troops there. Well, yeah, but we're losing it to Iran. We have troops, as we know, it's not American, but we have a UNIFIL force of 18,000 troops from NATO countries in Lebanon. What are they doing to secure Lebanon and keep the peace in the region? Zero. Lebanon, as you know, is a democracy. How do we like that kind of democracy? I mean, I rest my case, you can make it better than me. So it is basically confront them, figure out what they want to do, and figure out who we can work with to make sure they don't do it. Okay, here and here, and then here.
Sorry, just a quick question, Ambassador. What happens when those goals, seeing the region through the Iran prism and then supporting some kind of ground game in a theater like Iraq, conflict? And I'm thinking about the energy waivers, the oil waivers for Iran to sell gas or energy to Iraq and the Iraqis to be able to dollarize it and give it back. What do we do there when the stability of Iraq is one priority and then pushing back on Iran is another?
Okay, I covered that earlier when, remember I said, so what you do is, it's a simple rule, whatever they like, you don't do, whatever, but I said sometimes you have to make exceptions. The problem is, you will tend to make exceptions because of another phenomenon that most of my theories are 30, 40 years old, but this one is fairly new. Experts. See, we will turn to the Iraq experts and they will all uniformly say, we've got to protect the stability of Iraq. What Henry Kissinger would say and had said on several occasions is, if I think of Bangladesh, I don't care about stability. I care about defeating the goals of the enemy. So let Iraq make the decision. In the case of Iraq, I mean, that's a very good point. The Iranians just through their proxies shelled the most important gas field in northern Iraq that the Kurds use to maintain 24/7 electricity. Nobody has that kind of electricity in southern Iraq, although they have much more gas than the guys in the north have. Why? Because the Iranians have put the pressure on the political system not to exploit their massive gas holdings to generate their own electricity, rather buy gas and electricity from Iran to increase Iran's hold. Now, we could have pushed back against that. And I was involved in decisions over the last decade plus where we didn't, time and time again, stability, we didn't want to shake the tree, maybe they wouldn't cooperate with us in the fight against ISIS. Well, hell, that was their fight more than ours. I mean, it's the kind of thinking that we go through. So anyway, sir. But that wasn't a good answer, but it's the best I can do.
Should I go?
Well, you first, ladies
Okay.
first, and then your colleague to your right.
Really briefly, Ambassador, thank you very much for your comments. I could listen to you all day long. South America, we have the Monroe Doctrine. We have Iran, Russia, China, in Venezuela and other countries, Hezbollah. What do we do about our southern hemisphere?
I don't know, because our trade, strategic, and political interests beyond immigration are very limited there, and our tools to put pressure on them a lot less. So it's the same thing with sub-Saharan Africa, where, as you know, Russia in particular, but also both Russia and China are very, very active. It's very hard to mobilize the kind of tough love that I just laid out if you cannot point to immediate odds. Boy, if you don't fix the situation in Argentina, ships won't be sailing around South America in 6 months. I honestly don't know how to do that, because it's hard enough to mobilize, as we see with Ukraine, as we just saw with Ukraine, as we see in the Middle East, as we see to a lesser degree with China. It's very hard to mobilize if the threat isn't acute. Sir.
When I was governor, I had a chance to go to South America and spent a lot of time down there, well, some time down there. And I came away believing we could get ahead of the game if we moved on South America 10 years ago. We could get ahead of that because they were unsettled and very willing to work with us. I think we haven't gotten ahead of the game in South America. But look, like Carl, I could listen to you all day. I think you've raised all kinds of issues in your talk. I think that Kissinger was a status quo guy. I think Reagan was the revolutionary, and he won. He said, we're going to win, he won. But here's where my question to you. I've been in politics my whole life, and I don't believe in coincidences. And we've got one. I think Ukraine is the pivot on which the whole future of the United States rests. I think that because it has a direct bearing on Europe, and I think Europe is essential to the existence of the United States. So I just can't emphasize this too much. But gee willikers, just about the time that things are, moving along in the right direction in Ukraine, we end up with an explosion in the Middle East. What a coincidence. Do you think there's you could dismiss this and I won't be insulted, but is there some possibility here that the Middle East is actually a grand diversion away from the central point of the international conflict, which I think is Ukraine?
I think that, first of all, the local actors, in this case Hamas, had their own reasons for doing this, but they did it within an environment, as did Iran in an environment. The way, look, we don't quite run proxies the way Iran runs proxies, or the way China ran its equivalent of proxies, but you're all ambassadors, most of you are ambassadors to countries more or less under the American collective security umbrella. You know what we do and how much influence we have on not so much what country, if it isn't critically important to that country, we can usually stave off things that would undercut our larger interests, or at least postpone it or buy them off or do one or another thing. That didn't happen in October and since October. Not with Hamas, not with the Houthis to some degree, not with Hezbollah, only with the other, the fourth group, the Hashishabi. They're all H's, and the Hazara are the Iranian allies in Afghanistan too. So there's the 5 H's. That one did work because we suddenly launched a very dramatic set of strikes across Syria and Iraq, and that made everybody stand down. That's been the most effective deterrence that we've done, other than the defensive one of stopping the Iranian strike. So, we're winning some things, but it's not linear, but it's an environment, it's a mood. Where Reagan, I'm not sure Reagan was a revolutionary, because I think he just more aggressively carried out George Kennan and Henry Kissinger's strategies. Kissinger's policies were informed by a collapse of confidence in America, and I lived through it, many of you also lived through it, in the 1960s over containment strategy and over our military presence in the world. He had to deal with that and somehow build it back together, and he did. The CSCE Treaty, the Helsinki Final Act, the flipping Egypt, Paris Accords with Vietnam, the nuclear agreements with the Soviet Union, flipping China. I mean, this is massive, amazing in 4 years. We haven't seen anything like it. But he just stabilized status quo, a situation that was collapsing. Reagan sees the opportunity to increase the pressure, but under the main aegis of the strategy that George Kennan had laid out 35 years earlier. That's why it collapsed. But again, it's the overall environment. People they were afraid, despite not responding adequately to the Marine barracks and our 2 embassies and a couple of other flaws of the Reagan administration. People were afraid to challenge Reagan. I can list a lot of Trump's failures, including pulling out of the JCPOA, but people were afraid of Trump. You never knew what he would do. Either fly off and see the North Korean dictator or kill Qasem Soleimani. You just didn't know, and there's something to be said for a policy that keeps the other side guessing.
Can I just quickly
Sure.
Say something, which is, I get the feeling that the Biden administration doesn't have the credibility to really go after Iran. And I say that because you just said, for example, that the envoy to Iran, there hasn't been one for a year. How can you say that the administration is really serious about doing something with Iran? We don't even have a guy in charge, an envoy there. Same thing with the sanctions. Yes, we have, Jake Sullivan is always saying, yes, we have sanctions, but we don't enforce them. This business of trying to have it both ways, it seems to me, is very counterproductive in terms of making ourselves credible against Iran.
Yeah, their Iran policy is 1/3. They don't believe what I my analogy with Kissinger on a revolutionary power. They really don't. Certainly Barack Obama didn't. Remember his quote in 2015 to Jeff Goldberg of The Atlantic, Saudi Arabia needs to, by Saudi Arabia meant us, needs to learn to share the region with Iran. That's a non-revolutionary accommatist power. That was the Russians talking to the French, maybe the British, in 1870 about learning to share the region with an ascendant Germany. That's accommodation within a non-revolutionary situation. That's what these people believe. They don't buy my idea of Iran as a revolutionary power. They won't, that leads to certain consequences. The second thing is, to the extent they might believe that or harbor the possibility, they're not willing to do the hard work because it's dangerous, it's ugly. It means, and there's my expert, Ambassador Gabriel, it means making a horrible situation for the people of Lebanon, possibly even a little bit more horrible, stopping our funding of the Lebanese army. I honestly don't know what we're accomplishing with it. But that would send a message that no more accommodating anybody who is in any way assisting or not working hard enough against Iran and its proxies, and that's very tough. And you have to prove the case, and these guys haven't had the case proved to them yet.